There are methodologies under development for herd management, things like improving the health of the animals, finishing them earlier. All of that tends to reduce methane emissions. Maybe even trimming the herd so you get rid of the unproductive animals and focus on the productive ones. It can include the use of dietary additives such as oils and tannins. Some of this stuff is still theoretical, some of it's pure science fiction, like genetically manipulating the gut flora to produce less methane, or introducing kangaroo flora into the ruminant, and those sorts of things. But some of it is quite practical and makes a lot of sense. Not to say it's going to be easy, but it may make some sense and be stuff you're doing anyway. So those environmental performance standards, those environmental integrity standards that I alluded to before, these are basically what we're talking about. If you say you're reducing emissions over here by managing the herd or using fertiliser more efficiently or whatever it is, and you make a bit of money out of that, and you then invest that money into expanding the herd over there and using more fertilisers over there, that's called leakage, because on balance you're still producing more emissions. So there's no way they can really police that, but they ask you, they stipulate in your application that you need to manage that risk of leakage, and they want you to show that you're doing that. You need to make sure that what you say you're doing about emissions or carbon sequestered in the landscape is measurable and verifiable. You can't just say, oh yeah, we did this with a few cows and we reckon we did that. No, you actually have to be quite specific. And it has to be to the point where somebody else, if they come in, an independent person comes in and vets your operation, comes up with the same figures. It needs to be internationally consistent, so you can't start using numbers or metrics that you dreamt of in your backyard. You actually have to use the ones that are used internationally, which can be a pain, but it just means that a tonne of carbon not emitted or sequestered in Australia is worth the same as one in Finland or Sweden or wherever. And your estimates need to be conservative. So you can't make outlandish claims. You actually need to go back a little bit, and they want to see evidence of that. And need to be supported by peer-reviewed science, which means that you might have some really great ideas and they look like they're working, but unless there's some backing by the scientific community, which can be painful because that takes a while, they're not going to recognise them. But it's these two last ones that are the biggest sticking points for people. I'll go into those really, really briefly, and I know Ben Keogh will go into those in more detail later on. The first one is additionality. Essentially that means you need to be doing something that isn't business as usual. So as a very, as a start, you need to be doing something that you're not obliged to do. So in Victoria we have native vegetation management laws. You can't just say, well, I'm not clearing that patch of bush and I want money for that, because you can't clear that patch of bush anyway, so why should anyone give you money for that? But in addition to that, other practices have to be deemed beyond common practice. And that means that they look at your industry, they look at where you are in the country, and they say, well, this is common practice. So it might be, in Western Australia, for instance, conservation tillage is becoming common practice, but it might not be deemed that yet in other parts of the country. And so that is beyond common practice. And they actually have a list called the positive list. And it's by regulation, it's tabled in Parliament, it's approved by Parliament. And that lists all the things that are deemed additional. Originally, they were going to go around to each and every operation, each and every project, and scrutinise it to see whether it was additional or not. Well, that would just be a headache. So they've just said, right, we're just going to make up a list. And stuff can be added to that list, and over time stuff can be removed from that list. But it's basically what is beyond common practice, what is not business as usual, and that is what then makes that eligible. And the really nasty one that sticks in people's throats, but is not necessarily, won't be a problem for everyone, is permanence. It's often called the 100-year rule. It does not apply to stuff like this, livestock, fertiliser management, manure management, and so on, rice growing. It only applies to these two: reforestation, avoided deforestation, or managed regrowth. So it's about sequestration of carbon in the landscape. And it's basically saying you have to store that carbon for 100 years. That sounds horrible, and it sounds like a big risk to a lot of people, and it actually goes on your title. So be careful about that. But I'm just going to be explaining to you why they've come up with this. try and put some sense to it. And one of the reasons is because they want assurance, they being the market, the people who buy these things, and the community who will ultimately decide whether they support this scheme or not. They want assurance that where carbon is sequestered in the landscape, it stays sequestered in the landscape for a decent period of time. Why 100 years? It has to do with the residence time of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Remember I talked about methane dropping out of the atmosphere really quickly in about a decade or so? Carbon dioxide lasts a lot longer in the atmosphere, 100 plus years. So they want to know that the scheme has high integrity, and one of the underpinnings of that integrity will be this permanence. Subsequent governments to this one may decide to change that. There's been some talk about that. But if they do, let's say they bring it down to 30 years, and other schemes that have sort of pilot schemes around the world have come down to 30 years, that's fine, but what they'll probably do is apply a discount to the value of the carbon credits so traded, so they'll be worth less. So this scheme has got to have integrity for it to have a social license to operate. And if it doesn't, the world is watching. Really, this is one, as I said, this is the most ambitious scheme in the world, and they're really watching us. So as painful as that is, there is method to the madness.